Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Wild, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2. So the third and final meeting against the Minnesota Wild this season, the Sharks won the first two, but they end up dropping this one. And this was actually a pretty well-played game by the Sharks. They came into this one with a 3-game winning streak, and they looked once again pretty solid, but it would not be enough to take down a pretty desperate Minnesota Wild team. Now, in the first period, it was pretty even, you could say, both teams trading blows, but neither really generating all too many dangerous chances. It would be the Wild with the first goal from Ryan Suter, but the Sharks would tie it up on the power play with a Stefan Noesen goal, and that would be the score at the end of the 20-minute period. Going into the second, it would get turned up a notch, more dangerous chances from both sides, but still nothing crazy happening. However, the Wild would get the only 2 goals of that second period, goals from Galchenyuk and Parise, to make it 3-1 going into the third. So it was going to be a tough hole to come back from the Sharks going into this third period against a pretty stingy Minnesota Wild team, but they would make it quite interesting. Not only would they get a goal from Thornton to make it 3-2, but they would actually start to get players to the net and actually start challenging the Wild goaltender Alex Stalock. In those first 2 periods, realistically, it never really felt like the Sharks were getting super dangerous chances. They got the 1 goal from Noesen, but otherwise, you could have probably watched that second period and guessed that they were only going to get a single goal, but in the third period, they really were pushing. They were clearly the much better team in that period. The Wild were sort of on their heels the entire time, just trying to hold back the barrage of shots. And it would eventually end up being enough, unfortunately, and the Sharks would drop this game and their winning streak would come to an end at 3. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He gets another start here for the Sharks. It was an okay game. He had no chance on the Parise shot. It was going to be a very tough save on the Galchenyuk one. The only one that you could actually talk about would be the Suter goal. It was a big shot from Suter, but it is one you would want to see Jones be able to make the save on. There wasn't too much traffic. I don't believe it was deflected either. So 3 very good games from Martin Jones, and here tonight, not at the level that it was as he was at against the Leafs or against the Penguins, but still okay. Going into the following game on Saturday, considering it's a back-to-back Saturday and Sunday, I suspect Dell will get one of those 2 games. Dell probably getting the Saturday one, while Jones will get the Sunday one against the tougher opponent. Next, I'll talk about Burns and Shemek, and I've mentioned that I'm going to be talking more about the younger players for the Sharks, but I had to make an exception, or a couple of exceptions here, because Burns and Shemek had fantastic games. These 2 players, I don't think there were any noticeable mistakes in either of their games, just completely controlling the pace when they were on the ice. Great defensive plays, which was nice to see from both of them, but also great offensive plays, not just from Burns, but from Shemek as well. Some great keep-ins, some very aggressive pinches, and it's very nice to see that these 2 players have once again found that chemistry between the 2 of them. They were a very successful pairing for the Sharks last season. It hadn't really happened yet this season, but this was a great game from them. They were potentially the 2 best players on the ice for the Sharks at the very least. The only 2 who you could potentially argue were competing for that would be Meier, and I didn't write him, but also Joe Thornton could definitely be incorporated in that. This line for the Sharks, the Meier-Thornton-LeBanc line that later became the Meier Thornton-Sorensen line in the third period, was very good all over the Wild for all 3 periods. While the first 2 periods, as I said, there wasn't anything super dangerous. They were still getting a couple of okay chances. It was in the third period where that line was really challenging. I wrote Meier only because Meier in particular really stood out to me as getting some great opportunities. He drew the penalty that led to Noesen's goal on the power play. He was making some great power moves, some decent shots as well. And just an all-around solid game from number 28 and from number 19 as well. Thornton, of course, a player who was potentially going to be traded at the deadline, ended up remaining with the Sharks. He seemed somewhat disappointed about that fact, but he's certainly been showing teams in these few games that he's played since the deadline what they have missed out on by not maybe inquiring a bit more about Thornton. And finally, I'll talk about Davidson. This is not his first game with the Sharks, as he played the other night against the Toronto Maple Leafs. I just didn't talk about him, but I'll talk about him tonight. He didn't get to play all that much in this game. I believe he even had the lowest ice time of any Sharks player with just under 10 minutes. But in the ice time that he did have, I thought he was pretty good with Tim Heed. No noticeable mistakes either from Davidson, playing a pretty decent defensive game, you could say. And with Jacob Middleton out with an injury, he should be out for at least a couple of weeks, potentially just until the end of the season. So Davidson's certainly going to get an opportunity to play here and is going to try to make the most of it. We'll see if he can do particularly well. I don't think the Sharks will actually bring him back next season, but we'll see if he can earn himself a contract with some other team in the NHL, as there could potentially be some eyes on him as a potential depth defenseman somewhere. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday as they'll face off against the Ottawa Senators, a team they have played once before this season. It was a pretty sad loss in late October, a 5-2 loss to the Senators. Of course, the Senators, one of the few teams who are pretty much at the same level as the San Jose Sharks, maybe a bit lower than them. And so we'll see if the Sharks can redeem themselves from their early season loss to the Senators and maybe try and get some of their pride back, considering the Senators do hold their first round pick this season, with a victory there. Class dismissed.